Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me to discuss the future of the office is Adam Segal, CEO of Cove. Adam, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to Trade Talks.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
And let's discuss the future of the office. And the million-dollar question is, will it even exist as it did once before? And if so, what will its purpose be?
I think it's becoming increasingly clear that no, it won't exist as it did before. I think everyone is kind of awakened to what technology can do and how that can redefine how we work. And while all of those systems were in place previously, unfortunately we needed a shock to the system to really put that into practice. So once you start to untether people and say, hey, you literally don't need this physical environment to be productive. And so we previously had this notion that offices and productivity went in hand. It's actually not true. There's not necessarily a direct correlation between the two. So I think it's just opening up everyone's eyes to say, hey, how can we do this better, more efficiently, at less cost in the future? So I think an office, as you know it, every day 9 to 5, I think it's going to be similar to a landline. It's going to be no longer part of future business practice.
How can companies establish meaningful perks programs for remote workers so they feel a sense of belonging?
Yeah, no, it's interesting because if you think about it, the notion that everyone in the office and that creates culture, that's not necessarily the case these days. When people are coming and going, there's travel, there's already work from home. So in some ways, by having this remote first approach, you're actually creating a stronger sense of culture. You're having to account for everyone's individual personal, likes, dislikes, how do they engage. I know my teammates far better now than I did prior to the pandemic. It's an interesting comparison where suddenly we're so hypersensitive to culture and what it means to be an employee and to have an organization all be working towards something, that now you have actually something to rally around, as opposed to the default setting saying, hey, we're going to go to the office and that's our defined culture. Now you actually like to proactively define that.
Yeah, that's an interesting case that you make. And one thing anecdotally that I've noticed, typically when you're a New York-based company, everything becomes about the New York office. I feel like it's been more evenly distributed, and that's an interesting way to think about it. Tell us about Cove and how you helped companies foster culture during the pandemic.
Sure. So I think what's cool and what's exciting about when you think remote first, as I noted, is it becomes more personalized. So the notion of culture and perks, and really perks are about creating that culture, right? As a standalone, I think they're valueless outside of making people feel engaged and add value to the overall work experience. I think the perk component that we've been able to do with organizations is say, hey, everyone's distributed, but how do we create a common component to everyone's work week or everyone's work month? So we'll literally box up thousands of boxes each month and send individualized notes based off the company. So we'll personalize them based off the company, print them so they're personalized, branded from the company, and then package with all sorts of goods and anything from paint night activities, different things in terms of cocktail making. And so they're all specific to that individual company and that individual culture. And we ship them to all of their employees wherever they are. And so what's really interesting is all of a sudden now you're increasing engagement, whereas before you had in-office perks that were largely intended to keep you there, right? Perks are often designed to keep you in the office, keep you working. Now you have a component of how do we actually keep people engaged with each other? And so what are the programs that we can create around that? And so I think it just lends itself to, again, learning more about your teammates, where not everyone shows up to an office happy hour, but you're seeing higher engagement numbers and higher components of interaction based off of being remote.
A trend that was in motion prior to the pandemic was this transition to large collaborative spaces where desks were shared, kitchens are open concept, and social distancing wasn't even a thought. So what will companies now look for in office space? And do you think they will want their leases to look different than what they did pre-pandemic?
Yeah, so you have two things going on essentially. You have short-term, meaning what's going to happen right now while we're literally in the middle of a pandemic and have to maintain certain social distances. I think during that time, there's a component of risk reward. What's the risk versus the reward of going into the offices? So by and large, until the actual infection rate come down by community and people take a deep look, there's not a strong argument to be made to go into the office right now. So let's think in terms of, okay, after that moment in time, after we get out of this terrible moment in our current society, what happens after that? And I think it's a very different, it's a different design than what you're used to, but it also doesn't necessarily have to account for social distancing in the same way. In fact, it's going to account for the notion of no more dedicated desks, right? If you're not going to the office every day and you're not required to go to the office every day, that's a underutilized resource that's just sitting there. So you need to rethink the space, and our role in that is helping design and layer in our technology to optimize the space and also the coordination, the interaction, but really think about how the space is being used from a behavior perspective, right? So the first thing you do is understand your employee base, understand how people are engaging, interacting, using physical environments, and then build a program around that, right? But the last thing in the world you're going to do, not the last thing, but most companies, I would say 90% of companies are not going to go and design a space that everyone has their own dedicated desk. It's just an inefficient use of space. And if you think more in terms of behaviors, collaboration spaces, so an environment like an open desk environment, that's not a bad environment. It's a good environment for collaboration. It's not a good environment for phone calls. There you have smaller rooms, call boxes. It's not a good environment for meetings. You have conference rooms. So you can design a space that actually, because we're so mobile with this laptop, you can go between spaces to fulfill your day when you go into the office. But again, you're not required to go into the office, because just the way you can pick up and use your laptop within this office environment itself, you can use it from anywhere in the world. So just really the office has become any place you can connect to Wi-Fi. Now, the benefit of being in a physical environment is you have your colleagues there. So we're going to actually be more intentional about those interactions. They're not going to be every day. They don't need to be every day. And we're actually going to get more value out of it, just like the way in which we're engaging on the culture side right now. And we're starting to learn more and more about people. That's what's going to happen in the future. We're going to be far more intentional in terms of the way we interact with each other.
That's an amazing point that you brought up about the intentions of meetings, not simply having meetings to have meetings. I'm sure a lot of people will welcome that shift in strategy. So let's talk about the real estate companies. They're going to obviously have to shift their expectations for leases and office needs.
Yeah, this is going to be, I mean, if you go through every example we're talking about, everyone's thinking in terms of how do we be more efficient with space? How do we think in terms of being productive first and not necessarily having an office? So when you take that mentality, it's going to lead to smaller spaces. There's no question. Demand has to drop. We're already seeing it. There's not renewals happening right now. So when renewals don't happen, the amount of vacancy just increases. There's more and more supply coming on the market, especially in large markets like in New York, San Francisco, DC. You see people getting out of their leases. There's going to have to change. The owners that don't have a strategy that thinks in terms of how are we going to be a part of the future of work, as opposed to continuing to do business as usual, are going to have a really, really difficult time filling space. And it's going to lead to a lot of a lot of vacancy. Just in the retail example, malls are getting converted into shipping centers for Amazon in Simon Properties example. So these places that used to be J.C. Penney's are now becoming, they actually have more value as being the modern day shopping center for online retailers, right? If offices aren't careful, the same thing's going to happen to them. Mm-hmm. So they really need to think in terms of how are people going to use space and sell a different product. It's time to update the product, bring real estate into the future in terms of how companies and actually individuals use space, and then match that to the way in which they engage and negotiate leases.
And to wrap up, what's the cost to companies for this shift in real estate and facilities strategy?
The average company, if you look at any, like a Slack or a Morgan Stanley, will spend anywhere from 5 to 10% of expense on office space, which can equate to about $2,000 an employee. You're not going to be spending $2,000 an employee moving forward from a flexible environment. Not only from the flexible environment, but also be able to provide people perks and more personalized perks, meaning them be able to create the types of programs they want on a monthly basis. So I think net, when employees want it and companies can save money in a vacuum, every time, 9 times out of 10, 10 times out of 10, they're going to go for that. And we literally have an example of that. Employees want to have the flexibility to be able to work from anywhere. Doesn't mean they won't come into the office, just the ability and the flexibility, and companies can save money by reducing their space. So the net reality of that is office is going to shrink and there's going to be increased vacancy.
All right, Adam, appreciate the insight. Thanks so much for joining us on Trade Talks.
Great, thank you.
And thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.